get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for what I hope to be a wonderful discussion from an incredible alum from Princeton. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, or SPIA. And we're really fortunate to be partnering with Native Alumni at Princeton group to host a really lively discussion, as I mentioned, with Kim Baralek, class of 1997. My name is Rita Truelove. I'm Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at SPIA. And on behalf of our dean, Amani Jamal, I'd like to extend a really warm welcome to all of you from her as well. One of the main pillars of Dean Jamal's strategic plan is implemented on equity and here at SPIA, but also as we're out in the broader world. And I really feel like one way that we do that is to engage with the outstanding diverse alumni of our institution. And my hope is that this discussion, which delves into issues that are so essential to access and opportunity, will allow us to consider all the ways that consequential rulings like the summer SCOTUS decision on affirmative action can shape the world and spur us to think creatively about how individuals and an institution can navigate what's next. When Yolanda Koya, one of our incredible trustees, first reached out to me to discuss this event, I was really excited. I really cared deeply about engaging with and drawing from the lived experiences of our alumni and their expertise. And the connection of this with SPIA is really clear to me, particularly when we think about both the historical and contemporary federal policy and its outsized impact on Native American communities and people. And it's only natural that we, as a policy school, would be in conversation with scholars and practitioners who are shaping many of these policies and really thinking through the implications. And so, as I mentioned before, we're always honestly thinking about policy at SPIA and the ways that our scholarship and our leadership impact the world and affirm that unofficial motto of being in service to the nation and the community. And so, with that, I'm really delighted to introduce our Native alumni at Princeton host, Yolanda Gomez-Toya, who is joining us on Zoom. Class of 1988, a graduate of SPIA and co-leader of the Native Alumni at Princeton group. She's a pediatrician in Rio Rancho, New Mexico, and serves as an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. She founded and co-leads, the Native Alumni of Princeton Affinity Group. She sits on the Princeton Art Museum's advisory group for Indigenous North America, and she advised on the creation of the new endowed professor of Indigenous Studies. Thank you for joining us, Yolanda.
Thank you, and thank you for hosting this with us. As she said, good afternoon, I'm Yolanda Gomez-Toya from the great class of 88. I also was recently inducted into the other great class of 1983 as an honorary member. I am also an enrolled member of the Hickory Apache Nation in northern New Mexico. So one of the things that we've really pushed for is letting people know that many of our alumni have graduated and have gone on to do great things, and most have gone back to their tribal communities and homelands to do them. And so one of the goals of our Native alumni group is to highlight the many diverse careers and endeavors that our alumni have achieved or are achieving, and that involves asking them to come back and to give talks on campus and re-engage. Last spring, we had Patrick Anderson, who's class of 75, who is Tlingit and Aleut from Alaska. He gave a talk on adverse childhood experiences, which means a lot to me as a pediatrician, and how the study of that can bridge the health and behavioral disparity in Native American communities. Before we start, though, I want to thank again the School of Public International Affairs, especially Raina Truelove. Thank you so much. Also others, Todd Bristol and Lauren Moscow. She was very helpful. Also Sean Maxim, who's the Associate Provost at Princeton in the Diversity and Inclusion Office, and Emily Latham, who coordinates a lot of our activities through the Alumni Office. Today, we welcome Kim Baralek, who will speak about Native America after affirmative action. Of course, the recent SCOTUS ruling was not completely unexpected, but nevertheless was very troublesome for many of us, including those of us who are Native American. From my personal experience, I would never have gotten into Princeton for my undergraduate work, into UC Berkeley for my graduate work, or the University of New Mexico School of Medical School, if it were not for affirmative action. After Kim's presentation, we will take questions from the audience. If you are joining us online, please put them in the chat box and we will try to address as many as we can. We have about 15 minutes. And I want to say thank you again for everyone for making the time to be here. This recording, we are recording, so it will be on our webpage. But right now, I'd like to introduce Kimberly Varalek. She is Eastern Shoshone tribal member and is part of the 250th Princeton class of 1997. Kim currently lives in Denver, Colorado, and serves as the Tribal Affairs Branch Director within the Environmental Protection Agency's regional office. After graduating from Princeton, Kim returned to the West and directly attended the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. After receiving her JD, she practiced in Colorado for several years before moving back to the Wind River Reservation, where she served for over 7 years as the Attorney General for the Eastern Shoshone Tribe. As Attorney General, Kimberly represented the tribal government in all facets of law, including jurisdictional and civil litigation, tribal law and policy development, transactional and administrative law issues, and tribal enterprise representation. She was then recruited to join the EPA Region 8's Office of Regional Counsel and began federal public service with the US EPA in 2014. Moving from federal attorney to policy advisor to tribal affairs director in her current role, Kim advises regional leadership and staff in all facets of regional and national agency tribal policy, consultation, and capacity building for their work with 28 tribal nations and their environmental programs. Kim also served as the chair and commissioner with the Denver American Indian Commission and currently serves as a commissioner with the nonprofit People of the Sacred Lands Truth, Reconciliation, and Education Commission, evaluating previously overlooked truths on severed tribal land rights in Colorado. Kim and her significant other, Jeremy, spend time with friends and family located throughout the West in Wyoming, Colorado, South Dakota, and New Mexico. Thank you, Kim, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for joining today, for coming in. I also recognize folks online. Thank you very much for attending today. I think this is a helpful and an important discussion as a Native alum that we continue to take a look at these issues, especially on the Princeton campus, how it's going to affect us here and across Native America. I do want to just do a quick acknowledgement. I'd like to thank the university, President Eisgruber, the School of Public and International Affairs, especially Raina and the folks here who are hosting us today for welcoming us and having this continued conversation. For the Princeton Board of Trustees and especially Yolanda, we're very proud of you. Keep up the good work. We'll continue to support you and do what we can. We appreciate all of the alumni here, guests, students, faculty, and others. I'd also like to acknowledge Jeremy and my nephew, Demian. Thank you guys for joining us today. We really appreciate you coming out to support us. And class 97, have a good one. I do want to acknowledge this in a people, a place, and an event time. And so with the people, we want to acknowledge those who help us. We want to acknowledge the people who have brought us together. In terms of the place, we do the land acknowledgements. We recognize that these are Indigenous homelands. The Lenni Lenape peoples and the nations across the United States. We recognize the communities here, the continued service that they provide to us, the guidance and their contributions of their homelands. Put an asterisk here because I want to come back to this and what does this look like in terms of after affirmative action, or what can we do when we're activating ourselves and activating and contributing to our communities after what we call affirmative action. I'd also like to acknowledge the time, the Indigenous Peoples Day. We recognize this on Monday. Many communities, including the city and county of Denver, where I currently live, we recognize Indigenous Peoples Day in lieu of Columbus Day to celebrate and acknowledge contributions of Indigenous Americans across the United States in our local communities, and how we are not just memories of history, we are active community members, continue to contribute and bring vibrancy to our nation. So we will go ahead and move into the presentation.
My story, I'm Eastern Shoshone from the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. I was born, so this is my homeland here, all across the West. You can see from Canada on down, and I consider myself a member of all of these places. Born in Denver, I was raised in and lived on the Wind River Reservation before kind of moving my way down into New Mexico. This is a picture of our community that you can see, especially in the springtime. So a lot of mountains, a lot of open spaces. I graduated from high school in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So I've been part of this Western community for quite a while. This is important because I want you to understand where I am coming from. Like Yolanda, until I actually applied to Princeton, I did not know where Princeton was. I did not realize it was in New Jersey. I had heard of New Jersey. I had never really been, actually that's not true. I did go to Atlantic City once. That was when I was young. But regardless, I didn't really appreciate where I was and how I could get there. Top of my class at Capitol High School in Santa Fe, New Mexico. When I matriculated, I was one of 5 students from New Mexico and possibly one of 3 students from Wyoming. That's not very many students who represent the West. And I hope that because of my background, I wasn't being checked as a box for this entire area, but it's possible. It's entirely possible. I do want to acknowledge Dean Hargadon, late Dean Hargadon, who was our admissions officer. One of the great things he said to us at Alexander Hall, during our first class, was congratulations, you are the top of your classes, and look around you because so is everybody else. That is a very humbling moment. It is a very real moment where you acknowledge yourself now in a place where those opportunities may not be open to everybody. And actually in the 1990s, this would have been 30 years, 25, 30 years post affirmative action. So again, the history of this particular institution and this area and having or holding Native students is not something that we readily enjoyed throughout history. And so it was a pretty big moment. It was very humbling. And then you realize, like, yeah, I'm good, but I also recognize there's so many people here who are better. But that's the challenge. That's the challenge of being here. That's the challenge of representing and making sure that my experience when I came here, that I'm actually bringing information, as I mentioned, maybe 8 students out of 2 states in the West, bringing our experience here, hopefully informing, hopefully, providing some great interaction and experience, reminding people Native Americans do exist. And so it was great. It was really great. I also wanted to mention that another message that Dean Hargadon told us was, you are here, but we could have had just as talented, just as smart, just as a contributing class, an entirely different class, people who were just as talented. And so it really is, again, an acknowledgement that there's something special about the students here, what they bring to the table, and hopefully what they are going to share in terms of their experience, both where they came from, but then where they're going. I also served as a student recruiter, and I think this is really important as we start looking at the discussion for affirmative action. Like Yolanda, I hope that I would have been here anyway on my achievements, but I'm sure that some of my history and my contributions helped bring me to Princeton, helped me to be an attractive candidate. In our student recruiting, we were told and we shared that there is no one specific design, that there is no one particular path for a high school student or a student to matriculate and to apply and become a Princeton student. I thought that resonated very well because, it's not just academic focus. It's not just who do you know, so we say. It's not just how many, what's your highest test scores. It was, were you involved in your community? Were you an athlete in like what kind of things did you do to contribute to your community? And we had the pleasure of taking the admissions tour today. And still some of those concepts, those pieces are still evaluation points from what I understand is an entry point in questions for Princeton. Those are really critical questions because again, I hear the term now holistic, looking at us in a holistic way. I still think that that's a valuable point. That was a valuable communication point that we shared in early 1990s. I do hope that that continues to contribute to Princeton and campuses across the United States. I graduated in spring of 1997, class of 97. I did return back to Denver. I went immediately into law school, and then I was able to go home to Wyoming and practice. I'm a federal Indian law attorney by trade. Didn't start out that way, I did a lot of general practitioner work. But when I went home, I also found that Indian law in and of itself is general practitioner work. But we operate under specific codes. And these are the 18 USC codes, our federal laws, 25 USC are criminal statutes. And what I really took away from this was two things. One, I did a lot of on-the-job training because in my law school, we had Native students, very few. We had some introductions to Indian law, some great practitioners. But even here on campus, we did not have, I think, a really strong foundational presence of the relationships between Native America and being a Native American and what that means in terms of this country and this country's history. Oftentimes we would see mentions in the history class, sometimes ancillarily in some policy classes. I can't speak for every class since I've been gone, and that's been a while. I don't want to say how many years, 25 plus. I can't speak for every class in that time frame, but I do want to appreciate and acknowledge again Yolanda, because in her work and some of the Native alumni efforts, we do have an Indigenous chair who's going to be helping, I hope, guide some of these studies and contribute to this conversation as we move forward in terms of the Princeton curriculum. So that's a long-winded piece. I didn't mean to take too much time here in terms of my story, but I'm going to go ahead and move forward. I want to talk about affirmative action just very briefly. We all understand that the Students for Fair Admissions, the Supreme Court case, has really sort of changed the dynamic of how we approach learning in institutions. How do we make sure that we're still providing the top of the top experience for not only students who maybe have a long legacy with, and I don't need to use that term, it's a term of art, but a long history and understanding with some of these higher level institutions, but how do we make sure we continue to have representation in our community? When we talk about the history of affirmative action, first of all, I want to say welcome. I'm so glad racism is over. It's not, clearly. It's clearly not. We acknowledge that. So how do we set ourselves and remind ourselves where we are? Through affirmative action, we used to have policies where separate but equal. Those were enough, if you will. And there were some of the legal terms, some of the legal cases, Blessing versus Ferguson. I may mention a lot of these cases here. It's just to give you some basis, and we'll make sure that we have some of these resources or provide resources to not only Elizabeth, but we work with Brina as well to do some follow-up. But we talk about moving forward in time where we didn't even have equal access. And then when we look at Brown versus Board of Education, it wasn't just enough to say, you have the same things, we needed to be in the same spaces together. So we take a look at that premise, and we take a look at how far has it come since that time frame. We're really talking about the mid-1960s, and we can take that and anecdotally apply it here to Princeton, where women, people of color, we were not admitted to this institution until the 1960s. And when we take a look at that, and we look at the complexity, and just the complexion, if you will, And that change, and then you listen to some of the experiences of alumni, it has grown. Many people and some of the folks that I know, especially from earlier classes, had a really extremely hard time coming here just because of their own personal background, some lack of support, this unknown, just kind of meshing everybody together type of activity. But through time, we have grown, and hopefully those experiences are becoming greater and greater. With the recent Supreme Court case, when we talk about how the policies and application of trying to bring these communities together into a space that was historically not open to women, not open to people of color, we take a look at that application and saying we value women, we value people of color, we value people who are disabled, we value people from a different background, socioeconomic, all of those kinds of things. Those were communication points in the 90s. Those are communication points that we're still saying today. And I think the complexion of the university has grown to become that global representation, but we can still do better. One of the pieces here where we talk about the findings, specifically under the Supreme Court case, where they talk about where race is a determinative tip. This is a key indicator point specifically for Native America, where we, and I'll get into this here in just a moment, where being Native American is not a race, it's a political class. It's a classification point. It's something that I don't think that we embrace as a country. I, as a policy advisor, have had to advise leaders across this nation that jurisdictional issues in Indian country are still a thing, that it's not settled where reservations or Indian country lands might be. Indian country is a term of art, that there is a strong history, it's a political history, and we'll get into that. But it's very important when we start talking about how does equal protection and the findings now of the Supreme Court, how does that affect Indian country? How does that affect Native students, especially as we're looking to try to continue to be included in spaces like this? That gets to the big question, ensuring representation and fairness. How do we continue to do that? Again, I'm going to return back to this. I know I have some markers here, hopefully to keep us going, and I'll try to split up a little bit. So when we talk about Native America, and I mentioned to you as a political classification, this is a long storied history. We usually talk about this as, I would say, it's American Indian. That's a term that we continue to use as a legal term. Native Hawaiian, or not to Native. This is generally this classification because of the political relationships and the legal relationships that we have had with the United States in terms of recognition. This, when we talk about the work that we have and that we've done in the past, when I say we talk about nation building, we have a nation to nation relationship with the United States as political, as sovereign nations, as political entities. And we do not acknowledge necessarily that that we are one people. We are not one people. We have multiple cultures, multiple languages, and throughout the history of the United States, we have different interactions with various governments, whether it's the United States formally, whether it was colonies, whether it was other nations, Spain, France, England. We had land grants. We talked about different interactions all across this country. And so we cannot say that we have a unified experience, that we are a one race. We have those nation building recognitions, and that's what I consider to be just a very brief look or glimpse into federal Indian law. Based on our Indian law principles, the legal relationships, those political relationships that nations have with the United States, that is called we have a federal trust responsibility and a responsibility to speak with nations on a government to government level. I will share an anecdote with you in terms of some of the federal jurisdictional pieces. I had a conversation with a US attorney one time, and he shared with me that some of the political issues that were happening on my reservation were a result of the fact that the United States did not include the state of Wyoming in discussions with the tribes to negotiate our treaties. The state of Wyoming did not exist at that time. So we predate the nations, some of those relationships when we look at states. We predate that, and that's why that relationship is a federal nation relationship. And so we acknowledge it. It's a long-standing history. I'm going to very briefly identify, these are some of the concepts you learned in Federal Indian Law 101. We look at the Marshall Trilogy, the cases specifically located within the Southeast, dealing with some of the, what we call 5 civilized tribes, where we have identified in law that tribes are political sovereign nations. In Santa Clara versus Martinez, this is a more recent case. This is like 1950, 1960, if not later. We have affirmed through the Supreme Court that tribes can determine their own citizens. The United States cannot tell you who is a tribal citizen. Nobody can tell you, a state cannot tell you who is a tribal citizen. Only the nations get to self-identify and determine who that membership is. Some of it is by blood quantum. Some of you may have heard that or be familiar with it. Percentage of blood is supposedly your citizenship. That's how you're going to prove that you're a citizen, and it has to deal pretty much with descendancy and rules of the BIA and policy from the early 1900s. Some do not. Some are purely descendancy. Some are, we've heard of the Freeman cases recently, where former slaves of tribal members were determined to be citizens of those tribes. So this is not a race-based determination when we talk about a political citizenship for a sovereign nation. We also talk about Warren versus Montgomery. This is where we really affirm through the Supreme Court of this political classification. So a lot of these resources, everything that I have said in terms of both affirmative action and the political classifications, this very brief history, everything that we talked about could be its own semester of study when we really talk about the legislative history, what was happening at the time, why were these reservations negotiated in some of these ways, why were some of these land grants, identified, so on and so forth. So I just want to make sure that you understand that this brief touch is really just a glimpse into this really very rich and vast history supporting why we have these relationships with tribes and nations here within the United States. I also, I mentioned that this is not, there is no Native American tribe. We often hear about tracing genealogy, especially between me. Some of the recent DNA tests, you may have indigenous ancestry, but it does not tell you specifically what tribe that you would come from. There's a number of reasons why I'm sure, Yolanda, that we're going to have another speech at another time talking about some of these ideas and concepts. How blood quantum is somewhat of a colonial term and it's continued to be propagated. But for now, this is how we determine citizenship. Tribes determine that, and they determine it in a number of different ways. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward into the impact of this Supreme Court decision on Native America. Some of the challenges, and before I actually get into this, let me start here. When we start specifically focusing on Native American as an ethnic group, we forget the duality. Yes, there are indigenous Native American tribes who have that continued cultural, continued ethnographic relevance and can demonstrate our history based on some of the places where we live, where we're from. For example, in Wyoming, Montana, South Dakota, all of those spaces, Utah, our tribes were somewhat nomadic, but we had our spaces. We have cultural sites. We have a tie. We can say with definitiveness, we have been here for thousands of years. This is our space, and we have the languages, we have the cultural references that tie us to specific spaces. We still have our cultural practices. But when we talk about classifications, and we use this as a term of saying, well, you're Native American, that doesn't mean anything. Ethnographically, it doesn't mean anything except it's an indigenous, potentially indigenous to an area or relevant to this area as a potential indigenous person. This focus, and including tribal or excuse me, Native American as an ethnographic or a check the box kind of maneuver, really erases and challenges us in terms of that duality, and for people to really appreciate the political relationships that we have as sovereign nations. It's very important that we continue to look and make sure that we acknowledge each other on that political status, and that by just simply saying, well, we have referred to you as Native American as an ethnic classification, it doesn't really embrace or identify the full political history of this country. I also want to mention Brackeen versus Holland. Many of you may have heard of this. It's the Indian Child Welfare Act decision that was decided. It was decided 2 weeks prior to the affirmative action decision. It was a 6-3 decision, I believe, where we have a majority of the opinion recognizing that Congress has a specific and a special relationship with nations, with indigenous nations, with Native American political classes here in the United States. There are some other concepts in that case that, one, I appreciate Justice Gorsuch's affirming opinion, where he's talking about the political history and how that political history really set the stage for the Indian Child Welfare Act. The issues that were happening, decisions that were being made, trying to erase the identity of indigenous nations, to erase nations themselves. Coming on the cusp of that policy, you start getting into self-determination, support of Indian children as maintaining family units to help tribes maintain their citizens, not to say as a racial classification that only Native American kids, Native Americans, can be with other Native Americans. That's not the point. It's a lot more involved. That's another whole lecture that we could talk about. But the biggest point is, in terms of challenges here, we did have an affirming opinion from Justice Kavanaugh that really reserved the idea that we have not resolved as a nation Native American as a potential looking at the Native relationships and those fraternal relationships as a equal protection violation. So in a very similar manner, we can see the Supreme Court taking a look at the idea or concept. Can we look at these tribal preferences? Congress that has enacted for political reasons, political relationships, do they violate the equal protection? These are going to continue to be challenges for Indian country as we move forward. I do want to come back though, because well, let me go ahead and move forward. I know that we're running in on time, but when we were talking about the impacts in Native America and affirmative action, these are definitely some of the challenges that we're going to be seeing and that we are very aware of in terms of erasing that political identity or creating more complexity when we're trying to have those nation-to-nation building and input in some of those activities. What I do see though is an opportunity, and I do hope that we're going to continue to be here as a people. The relationships that we have with the United States may change. We've seen multiple changes through the Supreme Court, through history. But one of the things that we did want to talk about, and especially when I mentioned Justice Gorsuch's affirming opinion in Brackeen, we talk about valuing political relationships. So I do want to say that there is at least that glimmer of hope. There is the acknowledgement that we have somebody who is on the Supreme Court who has an understanding, whether I agree with all of his opinions or not, he has an understanding of that political relationship and the political history of a lot of the laws that we have. And so by not joining necessarily or saying that It's a potential racial issue in terms of ethnicity. There at least is that conversation hopefully reserved and left to be had. I also want to take another acknowledgement point here for opportunities. One, when we talk about space and we talk about land acknowledgements, one thing that we can do is make sure that we are activating, not just saying that, hey, guess what, these aliens are still in here. We're actually activating. We're saying we not only acknowledge that these communities, that this was their homeland, but we are continuing to work to make sure that we are in a good relationship with those local communities and or others. And I want to take a point here because one thing that we can do with affirmative action, the recent affirmative action ruling, is stop acknowledging Native Americans as an ethnic group. We are a political class. Ask for our citizenship. Ask for our citizenry. I'm an Eastern Shoshone tribal member. I have a certificate of Indian blood. Very antiquated way to say I'm an enrolled member and I'm recognized by the United States on that enrollment. I do want to make mention that the basis for this, it's a lower basis to employ these types of policies. It's what we call a national basis standard. It's a lesser standard than what we call the strict scrutiny standard, which was applied in the SCOTUS opinion for affirmative action. The SFFA case. In terms of having these types of policies and moving forward, activating our relationships and asking for tribal citizenry, we move away from the concept that all tribal members are the same. We are not the same. I do want to make mention here, and this is where we're going to come back to. As a student at Princeton, I was also the vice president, and member of the Native Americans at Princeton student group. And we would work with admissions to get a list of students who had self-identified as Native American on their applications. So we would call these students, and I would have a list of about 24 a year. Half of those students were like, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't check that box. I'm not a tribal member. Half of them were like, oh, I thought that was something that we all said as US citizens. So to me, it did not help to have a box. It does not help to increase diversity or look for representation for Native American or people of an indigenous nation. Whether it's a federal nation or a state recognized tribe, we still have citizenship. We still have citizenry. It didn't help us to have a strong presence here with a box. So we can do better. I see affirmative action where we can't ask those questions, but we can start asking about citizenry to be a stronger actual method to encourage, to look at who are we including on campus. I also want to acknowledge that, I may look like a stereotypical Native person. I do come from the West, but we have a number of tribal members who, even my own relatives who are blonde hair, blue eye, and you would say that person's not Native, but they are. They're a citizen, and they deserve to be recognized as a citizen with that political relationship. Another opportunity to activate those land acknowledgements, and specifically here for Princeton, is act on those historical commitments to educating Native students. Princeton was one of the original colleges. There are several of the old institutions who received federal funding, early federal funding. We're talking 1700s, 1600s, where the point was, well, we're going to build this institution on your land, on your homeland. We're going to educate you. This is a relationship that we have. It's a political relationship. There are some of the original, I know that we talked about in the 1960s with affirmative action, how we were able to see a diverse student body here until the mid-1960s. We actually did educate multiple Native students in the early days of Princeton. There were at least two I think one graduated. We did a tour of another institution recently. We found out that they had 5 Indigenous students. I was actually really shocked to hear that for various reasons, one graduated, but they all died before they were 20. So I'm like, it's not a good experience. But still, the point was, you have a history of receiving federal money to educate those political representatives from these nations. And we can build on that. We can continue to build on that. We can make a commitment to continue educating Native students here and not only adhering to those federal interests, but looking at those federal obligations, honoring our political treaty responsibilities, honoring those early acknowledgements, those early commitments to educating Indian students or Native students, Indigenous students, because of where they came from, the nation that they came from, not necessarily because they were Indigenous identified. So these are opportunities. And so I want to talk about a little bit more when we talk, and I'm going to bring this back here to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. This is not a complete resolution for all students, but it is one way that we can continue to work with Native America. Again, it is federally recognized tribes, some state recognized tribes. It doesn't solve the issue for descendants or Indigenous students who have that ethnic background, but maybe they're not enrolled citizens for whatever reason. So what we want to do is what I think we can do is commit to the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility policies, where we're not only communicating those policies clearly, but we're doing that in a way where we're elevating and building on that diversity, and contributing to the overarching, and I would call it emerging area. Maybe it's not emerging, I don't know. I'm learning about this more and more, especially in my role now. There's a study, the McKinsey study, that when we talk about the value of diversity, DEIA, we talk about this in quantifying it, not just in metrics, not just saying, hey, look at how many students we have or who are representative, but it actually is a demonstrative or a quantified demonstration of increased productivity by over 30%, 33, 36%. Companies who had or increased or committed to diversifying not only their staff, but their leadership, saw an active profitability increase of over 30%. And I'm very interested in this because I always felt that when we talk about affirmative action, we were saying, we are doing you a favor. We, a majority of the world, we're doing you a favor by acknowledging you. What we're actually doing is we're challenging ourselves to be better. And at an institution like Princeton, where you have the best of the best, we are challenging you to be even better than that. You are going to have an opinion. If you walk into a room with everybody who looks like you can presume that you all have that shared experience. You all come from the same background and you're all thinking alike. You're thinking, and everybody's like, that's a great idea. That's a great idea. Let's move forward. When you have people in the room who do not look like you, who maybe are not the same gender as you, who don't have the same background, they might say, I don't get where you're coming from. And it challenges you as a person to defend your position, to demonstrate why you think this path is actually the best path forward. And it's been quantifiable and monetarily quantifiable through various studies. I think Princeton could really, or students, maybe incoming students or existing students, even faculty or other, maybe alumni, can contribute to the research behind quantifying diversity and creating those policies. Continue to have that demonstration of why are we going to continue the diversity and to make this a place where we want maximum representation. Committing also to students and leadership. So influence of power is another demonstration, making certain that we're not only diversifying our student body, but the leaders and the leadership. Again, continue to challenge ourselves, not doing things the same way because they're tried and true, but continue to bring people into the conversation who maybe did not have that same power demonstration that others have had in the past, to make ourselves better. We want to be better. We want to be more inclusive. We want to have the best product. We want to have the best access. We want to have the best conversations. We want to be leaders. This is how we do it. We can continue to do this. So through this, talk about all of these findings that some of these studies are coming through, innovation, increased talent pool, all of those types of things. I'm going to end my conversation with this graphic. I've been looking at some of the graphics. I really liked, this was a moment, an aha moment for me. I did like the box demonstration where you had people looking over the fence, and we talked about equality. In this first graphic here, when we talk about equality, everybody gets the same bike. Not everybody can use that bike in the same way. Not everybody has the same road to travel with that same bike. When we talk about equity in that same box category, we talked about stacking some other boxes, maybe for other folks who might need more assistance. I like this graphic where we're talking about let's give people, or let's make sure that we are bringing in the tools necessary when we're talking about equity. I think the SCOTUS decision, this is the minimum. We can continue to do better. We can diversify. We can bring people in with the tools that they have and that they need to still be challenging to us. And the other piece, and I don't have the graphic for this, but I'm going to go ahead and conclude here. But in that box where we have the children looking over the fence, we have the multiple boxes, and we called that equity. They changed the fence to a chain link fence or no fence. Change the game. We can do that. We can continue to change the game when we're looking at admissions, when we're looking at how we move forward with our country, by promoting, for example, acknowledging the political relationships specifically for Native America. We would be changing the game and not continuing to move ourselves into or push ourselves off into, or I would say maybe it's not necessarily marginalizing, but making ourselves invisible in a pool of indigeneity. We need to embrace a political history and continue to move forward as survivors, as continued citizens of peoples who are here, and people who can represent and contribute to the greater Princeton community and beyond, into other institutions as well. So with that, I'm going to conclude. I really appreciate your time, everybody online. Thank you so much. I know we're kind of all over, but in terms of this introduction, I really want to acknowledge again that I'm excited to hear about our Indigenous Studies, our chair. I'm really hoping that the conversations that we're talking about, I hope that these are not new conversations to you, but I will share with you during my time here, this is a foundational point for many of our leaders. And if we're not having these conversations about the political relationships, you're going to continue to need someone like me advising people that these issues still exist. There are still land challenges. There are still jurisdictional challenges that exist every day in terms of identity and how we're working with Indigenous nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. I don't see any questions in the chat box. I'm not sure if people will be able to add that now if they would like, and I can't see the audience. So Kim and Raina, if you could ask the audience if they have any questions for you right now.
You have a question here in the room, and I know that the microphone for the folks online, they might not be able to hear, so I'll repeat your question.
Sure. So my name is Martha Coven, and I teach here at SPIA in the graduate program. And I have two questions, which is totally unfair because I don't like it when people ask me two questions. I always forget the second one, but they're two burning on my mind. So hopefully you can answer both. One's a legal question, which is, I've been thinking through this as you were presenting, and I wonder whether tribes as sovereign nations, do you run into the national origin problem in terms of that being a category of discrimination? So even if you're not a race or ethnicity under civil rights laws, as it being is that too much like national origin? Are you going to have the same issue if you're trying to defend affirmative action policies? And the second is totally different, which is I teach a course in poverty and public policy here. And my students are interested in learning more about poverty in Indian country. And I've been doing some reading and talking to folks in the community, but I'm curious if there's anything that you'd say, this is what your students should understand about poverty in Indian country.
Okay, so the first question, let me make sure I've got this correct. So the
Yeah.
question is a legal question about nation of origin in terms of some of those protected classes as we look at affirmative action. In terms of nation of origin, that's one of the questions I'm going to give you a brief answer. I may think about this and contact you after the fact if I have a little bit more thought on this. But I would say that when we look at Native nations and Indigenous citizens, we're tri-citizens. We are American citizens, we're citizens of the state, just like everybody else, but then we also are that citizen of that nation. So when we look at nation, it's not completely separate from the United States. When you look at it maybe as like that nation of origin question, because we are not necessarily, I don't know, it's not any different than being a US citizen, but it's a good question as far as, do you hold any additional citizenships? We know that there are dual citizens of other nations, US, Canada, US, all of these other countries that have dual citizenship. And in terms of that national origin question, I don't really have a good answer for you, I would say. So I will think about it a little bit more, but I do want to start on that basis, that it's not an entirely separate nation, which I think a lot of people, especially who are not maybe active in Indian country, think that Indian country is just sort of this gray area, like another international community where no laws apply. That's not true. We have federal laws that apply in Indian country, state laws to a certain extent for some types of land, and then we have our tribal jurisdictions. So there's a complexity there that I think would challenge or maybe combat some of those questions that really depend on those separate sovereign issues. I don't know. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
And then to your second question, you really have to look at historical relationships and the political relationships where you have a nation that negotiated land, right? So tribes reserved rights, we reserved lands for ourselves and gave up rights to other lands, which are now a majority of either federally or state-owned and occupied lands. So when we look at the policies of how the United States has really chosen really, or made a decision not to honor some of those responsibilities, and or gave inadequate education, or took education and changed it into a boarding school scenario. There's a number of different things that we are still dealing with. I think as a people, we talk about 7 generations, you hear that term commonly, but it really is a long term. We're still dealing with trauma from the early 1800s, if you will, late 1800s to today, and we will continue. So every time we've had this significant change in policy, or we've made some changes, we've done some things to try to make things better and not work with tribes as nations or leaders, we have really created systems where we have dependency or addiction or lack of opportunity. So it's an entire, I think you have to look at the political history of the United States to say, where did we interfere and not allow tribes to make decisions for themselves? And how are we still doing that? So that's one area. It's broad. I don't think you can point to just one thing, but I would say that's a good start.
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions here in the room? Yes.
My name is Yana Moore. I'm from the great class of 1979. Kim, your presentation was excellent, and I hope it was recorded because it really needs to be shared. I learned so much about the nations and the structure. I was totally unaware of there not being some a racial alignment, although you're one of the boxes that has placed on many applications, and I'm hoping that despite that not being the categorization that's proper, that there remains a way to ensure that we all benefit from the presence of Native people in various environments, for however you might identify and be recognized and included in all of our lives, whether institutionally or other ways. I was very lucky as an elementary school student to have learned about the Lenni Lenape. And that was, yes, about 50 some years ago. And knowing that I was occupying land of those who were certainly far ahead of many of the institutions and people claiming the space. Recently, the town of Princeton changed its signs to say, instead of established, it just said, this is the town of Princeton. While it had an established date, I wish they really had gone further to say in the land of Lenape and to be descriptive, because that was sort of the reason why they took the established date off. Nonetheless, I here personally, but also as a representative of CBAT, that I know Yuli is familiar with, an organization that is seeking to have Princeton establish a center to combat racism, which we hope will be inclusive of Indigenous people. But of course, now that you're not defined as a race, I want to ensure that the kinds of issues that you've talked about are the issues that need to be discussed in that sort of framework. If we need to change a name or whatever, we don't want, because race is still, if you experience any anti-nation, anti-Native people, anti-Indigenous, as there is anti-Black, anti-Semitism, all the other ethnicities, that's an important inclusion that we want to emphasize and hope that you will be very much engaged in, despite the misnomer that they have to your definition. But again, thank you. I have so many questions that it would involve much more, but if you want to say anything.
Thank you. And just for our listener, folks who are listening virtually, again, we just appreciate the comments and inclusion and looking at Indigenous identities, the duality,
Right.
being an ethnic group, but also being a political class, and how that can contribute to some of the larger issues where we talk about racism or ending racism or experiencing that. How can we help contribute to that conversation? Not speaking on behalf of all of Native America, but I would certainly welcome and appreciate any opportunity to engage. And we'll work with Yolanda to help in doing things. Any other questions? I really went way over my presentation, so I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see you all. I hope this has been at least thought-provoking in some regards, whether you don't agree. And I also see some great opportunities, even though we are still cautious about moving forward. So, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. Just to continue, the Native alumni Princeton, we're really coming back to educate the campus about what Kim was saying, who we are, that Native Americans are still here, our communities are still here and thriving. And I think there's a lot of misinformation about Native people. I think the whole thing with the DNA testing that has come up, and I've heard it too, people see 2% indigenous in their DNA, and then they start claiming indigeneity, or what, that's a new word for me. And without understanding that being Native actually means being a part of a community and part of a tribal community and a place. We are trying to, our next spring speaker, we hope will be somebody who can talk about sort of the problems of DNA testing, and especially when it comes to Native people. A lot of Native people do not submit their DNA for testing, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So it's flawed in a lot of ways, but hopefully in the spring that'll be coming out, and we'll be sending out information about that as well. But again, I want to thank everybody for coming. Again, this will be recorded. We are working on our webpage through the university to post this presentation. And I want to thank Raina again for helping us do this. I really appreciate it. And I'll let you close up.
Thank you so much. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I hope you'll have an opportunity to at least chat with Kim before she leaves out. I know you're headed on a train. But again, I want to thank you for opening up this discussion, and really looking forward to connecting with you in the future and making sure that both this recording is available, but also some of the things that we talked about earlier around how are we embedding some of this really foundational history and contemporary issues within the curriculum here at the school. So thank you, Martha, for even talking a bit about some of the work that you're doing currently with your graduate courses right now. Go ahead, Sam. Yeah.
I was supposed to do this at the beginning of my speech. While I'm a federal employee, I do not represent the United States today. So I know this is a late disclaimer. These are thoughts that I've shared with you, my thoughts that I'm bringing to you as an individual, and then not representing the agency. Thank you.
Thank you all for everyone who's online and for joining us as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, guys.
Is it recorded? Great.